Grimm's fairy tales includes a very poignant story that goes as follows. There was once a very old man whose eyes had become dim and his ears were dull of hearing. His knees trembled, and when he sat at the table he could hardly hold the spoon, and he often spilt the broth upon the tablecloth, or he let it run out of his mouth. Now his son and his son's wife were disgusted by this, and so they made the old man sit in the corner behind the stove, and they gave his meagre portion of food in a earthenware bowl. And he would look towards the table with his eyes full of tears. On one occasion his hands trembled so much that he couldn't hold his bowl, and it fell to the ground and it broke. And the young wife scolded him, and bought him a wooden bowl instead for a few halfpence, out of which he now had to eat. Now one day they were sitting, getting ready for their meal, and the little grandson, he was only 4 years old, he began to gather some bits of wood upon the ground. "What are you doing there?" asked his father. "I'm making a little trough," answered the child, "for you and Mum to eat out of when you are old." Struck by what they had heard from their little son, the man and his wife looked at each other for a while, and presently they began to cry. Quietly, without saying a word, they took the old man to the table, and henceforth always let him eat with them, and likewise said nothing if he did spill a little of anything. Joy Davidman writes that the crudity of this fairy tale helps to illustrate what she believes is the naked and crude point of the fifth commandment: honor your parents, lest your children dishonor you. It is a stark conclusion to a thought-provoking fairy tale. The injunction to honor and respect one's parents and one's elders is not unique to the Ten Commandments. It could be said to be a fairly universal cultural norm in almost all traditional cultures and societies around the world. My experience of African culture is that respect for one's parents is really important. Parents and elders in African culture are not only command a lot of respect and are very kind of highly looked up to, but they have a lot of power and authority in the family structure, with most of this power and authority vested in the father. And in the extended family structure, it would be vested in the most senior male figure. Now, in Tibetan society, which is dominated by Tibetan Buddhist thinking, honoring one's parents takes on a very interesting twist, for it is the mother that is regarded with the highest honor. Even in popular Tibetan culture today, I understand that modern Tibetan pop songs are not about romantic love, as they are mostly here in the West. Instead, they are all about one's love and gratitude for one's mother. This tendency is deeply rooted in Tibetan Buddhist thinking, where all living creatures are regarded to have potentially been one's mother in a previous life. From this perspective, the Tibetan tendency to honor their parents, and especially their mothers, flows out of what they regard as a great debt of gratitude. Mothers, they would say, deserve our highest honor because we owe them our very lives. When we were helpless babies, we could not have survived without our mother's care, attention, and protection, or even learned the most basic skills of how to walk and how to talk. But before we stray too far from the fifth commandment itself, I'd like to get back to it and firstly look critically at this commandment. The first critical examination of this commandment comes when we realize that in Deuteronomy 21, verse 18 to 21, there is yet again a brutal and barbaric law that accompanies the fifth commandment, suggesting that those who disobey the fifth commandment should yet again be stoned to death. In fact, I could have said the same thing about last week's commandment to rest on the Sabbath, but it felt a little tedious and gory week after week to emphasize the same gory and brutal consequences for disobeying various laws contained in the Ten Commandments. But it is difficult to avoid, and it is another reminder that the books of the Old Testament can't be used as a neat and ready-made moral authority when it contains laws and consequences as barbaric, and one could say even as evil, as death by stoning. The second critical examination of the commandment comes in the form of criticism that this commandment does not necessarily foster loving, caring, or mutually respectful family values. In fact, when read in the light of Deuteronomy 21, it commands unthinking obedience, regardless of right or wrong, under the fear of being stoned to death. If honoring one's parents was originally conceived of in terms of unthinking obedience and unquestioned respect, as is the case in many traditional cultures, this would have been and would continue to be very difficult, especially for those whose parents have been less than honorable and less than caring and nurturing, apart from the fact that it would stunt the full psychological growth of a child. Now, the Apostle Paul, in light of his newfound faith in Jesus, clearly had some of these questions in mind when he was giving instruction to Christian families in the church in Ephesus. In Ephesians 6, he first addresses children, reminding them to obey their parents in the Lord. And his first appeal is not because it is commanded by God, but because he says it is right. Only then does he mention the fifth commandment, and that it is the first commandment with a promise that it would go well with them in the land. But straight after, unlike the fifth commandment, Paul addresses the parents as well, or more specifically the fathers, who would have held most power in the family. In verse 4 he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger." And in a parallel passage in Colossians 3 verse 20 he adds, "lest they become discouraged." Paul in these passages is beginning, I believe, to make a few baby steps forward. He has clearly come to learn from his own experience of the love of Christ that truly loving relationships require some degree of mutuality, even between parents and children. It can't just be that parent-child relationships have only a one-way responsibility. But if parent-child relationships are to be truly loving, it requires not just children honoring their parents, but also that parents should in some way be honorable and loving in the way they treat their children. Truly loving relationships do indeed require mutuality. This would have been quite a major new insight that Paul has come to. Certainly in Roman culture, fathers had absolute power. Carol Ashby describes that power as follows: the paterfamilias, or the father, had the power to tell any of his children to do something, and they were required to obey him. He had the power of life and death over all except his wife. He had the right to kill his child of any age, and the right to decide whether a newborn would be allowed to live or would be exposed to the elements to die, and the right even to sell his children into slavery. It was not uncommon for unwanted or defective babies to be exposed, and although it was legal, killing one's children after infancy was generally frowned upon, without extreme provocation. writing to Gentile Christians in the Roman Empire in Ephesus and Colossae, who would have been citizens, many of them, of the Roman Empire, Paul's small movement towards mutuality and love in family relationships would probably have been received as something quite revolutionary. Even if his writings, one could say, were only taking baby steps in the direction of truly mutual and fully mature loving relationships. In closing, I'd like to leave us all with a question. What might it mean for each of us today to honor our mothers and fathers? For each of us, our answers might be different. For some, it might mean wrestling with what it means to honor parents who are still alive, and how to live and engage with such parents in ways that are hopefully truly loving and mutual. For others, it might raise questions for how one might honor parents who are growing frail and who are becoming more and more dependent in the twilight of their years. For some, it might mean wrestling with how one lives in healthy relationships with parents who may not have been the best parents in the world, possibly distant, manipulative, or even abusive. For others, it might mean honoring the memory of a parent who is now deceased. What might it mean for you? As the Apostle Paul says in the fifth commandment, he says that the fifth commandment comes with a promise that it may go well with you in the land. I wonder if that could also mean the following: that you might live with a sense of well-being, peace, joy, and love in your heart. What in your own unique circumstances might it mean for you to honor your mother and father, that you might live with a deep sense of well-being, peace, joy, and love, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. Amen.